Welcome to Conversations on Peaceful Change, an initiative by the GRENPEC network. And today we have world-renowned scholar and author Steven Pinker from Harvard University. He is visiting Montreal in regard to his new book titled Enlightenment Now. He's the author of the very successful book called Better Angels of Our Nature, Why Violence Has Declined. So thank you, Steve, for coming and meeting us, and it's wonderful to have you here. I want to start by mentioning that I'm very impressed with your book. The first one in particular I mentioned, and the second one I read, and I must say that I was impressed with the breadth, the depth, and the amount of research in multiple fields that you have undertaken. It is breathtaking, and congratulations.
Thank you very much.
But how are these themes connected? The first book is, of course, you mentioned briefly Enlightenment. The second book, you go in more detail. Could you briefly tell what your core arguments and how they are connected?
Yes, well, for me, it's an unusual trajectory among people who write about the subject matter of international studies, because I'm a cognitive psychologist. I don't have a background in political science.
Right.
I came to it from an interest in human nature.
Yes.
I had written a book called The Blank Slate on why people deny the existence of human nature, why the blank slate is such an appealing doctrine, despite the fact that I believe scientific evidence shows we're not blank slates.
Right.
And one of the reasons is emotional and political, that people are afraid that if evolution gave the human brain aggressive motives, dominance, revenge, prestige, then that means that we are doomed to war forever. It's hopeless to try to reduce war. It's in our genes, it's in our evolutionary background. And when I wrote The Blank Slate 17 years ago, I put just as in a couple of paragraphs, well, that actually doesn't follow, because the human nature is complex. Brain's a big place, lots of stuff going on in there. So yes, there are desires for glory and dominance and expansion and even sadism, but we also have empathy. We also have social norms and moral norms. We're cognitive creatures. We have these big brains that figure out how to solve problems. We have language. We can negotiate. We can share the results of our discoveries. And so even if there is such a thing as human nature, which I argue there is, it doesn't mean that we are doomed to war forever, because we can treat war as a problem to be solved.
Human nature is malleable.
Human nature has not even so much that it's malleable, but that it's complex. It has many parts. The reason that I chose as the title of my book on violence, The Better Angels of Our Nature, taken from Abraham Lincoln, is that it captures the idea that there are many parts to human nature, and we can use some parts to defeat others. So it's that idea combined with my stumbling across graphs showing that some kinds of violence had come down over the course of history.
True.
So that just proves that we're not doomed to a fixed amount of violence, because history tells us that that isn't true.
Yeah.
And when I talked about the fact that homicide in Europe has fallen by a factor of about 35 since the Middle Ages. A fact I'd come across in studying violence. Then I got correspondence from political scientists saying you also could have mentioned the fact that deaths in war have come down since the end of World War II. There's the so-called long peace.
Yes.
I was stunned when I saw these data sent to me by Andrew Mack from Science Space University Human Security Report Project, from John Mueller, from Joshua Goldstein and others. And that's what inspired me to write the book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, because not only is it a key idea that human nature doesn't doom us to war, but there are these facts that most people are completely ignorant of. I was ignorant of it, and I thought the combination of this idea and these data deserve to be better known. Then, after The Better Angels of Our Nature came out, I came across other obscure but very important facts about humanity, such as other measures of human well-being showed improvement, that rates of extreme poverty have come way down, rates of literacy have gone up, rates of child mortality, maternal mortality, infectious disease. All of them had shown improvement, and no one knew about it. So it was, again, a set of facts from different disciplines, academic disciplines, that were not known to the newspaper reading public.
Yes.
And again, I wanted an idea to explain it, because improvement doesn't happen by itself.
Yes.
If anything, the universe is indifferent to us, and things will get worse if they're left to their own devices. And I thought that one of the ideas that propelled the decline of violence, namely that if we use knowledge to try to solve problems, and if those problems concern human well-being, then bit by bit we can succeed.
Yes.
That I take it to be the ideals of the Enlightenment, and that gave me the overall theme of Enlightenment now, the idea behind all the graphs.
So that's where I think it's fascinating to look at the Enlightenment. But one can make an argument that other civilizations have also ways of dealing with violence. The Indian civilization,
Yes.
Chinese civilization. And they would argue that it is not necessarily Enlightenment, but their civilizational values, maybe religious, maybe cultural, that are important as much as European Enlightenment. And so that's a dimension that perhaps we need more attention, given that the world is becoming more globalized, and that the next round of emergence of new powers, China and India, are definitely going to be there. So that's the fear that what if those countries, for instance, China in particular, doesn't value these core Enlightenment ideas such as freedom of expression, freedom of democracy, etc. How do we interconnect these civilizational values with the Western values?
Yes.
Is there going to be a clash of civilization, or is it going to be Thucydides' trap, or how do we avoid that kind of rise and decline of new civilizations, material power centers, etc.? Have you thought about it?
All excellent questions. So yeah, I often have to make it clear that when I talk about Enlightenment, the title of the book, Enlightenment Now, it wasn't to valorize a bunch of guys in 18th century Scotland and France and Germany and the British colonies. I needed a name for this set of ideas.
Sure.
And there was a concentration of expression of these ideas in that time and place. But it certainly is not, let's go back to these saints, these geniuses, and worship them and soak in their wisdom. In fact, they themselves would have been the first to disavow that, because what matters is the ideas, not the people, not the time, not the place. And if the ideas are good, they should really be good everywhere for all human beings. And indeed, the Enlightenment ideals, as opposed to the European Enlightenment, can come and have come from many sources. The Enlightenment thinkers themselves were influenced from ideas brought back from other parts of the world by explorers and traders and networks of people in conversation.
Spread of Buddhism, for instance, amazing that peacefully happened,
Yes, and in the 20th century, some key ideas of what we could call Enlightenment values came from India, such as the whole concept of nonviolent resistance from Gandhi, which of course influenced Martin Luther King.
You mentioned that in the book.
The women's movement and the gay rights movement. The idea from South Africa of Ubuntu, restorative justice and reconciliation. That has been added to the mix. An interesting generator of Enlightenment ideals is cosmopolitanism, the mixing of ideas and people. No civilization, and certainly no individual, is smart enough to figure it all out by themselves. It always depends on a flow of ideas, picking and choosing the best ideas.
Yes.
Now, the case of today, of contemporary China, is complex, because China, of course, in some ways is resisting the Enlightenment ideals of freedom of speech, democracy, while embracing others like markets, free trade, and
institutions too,
and institutions,
international institutions.
Whether there'll be a Thucydides trap, I don't know, but I don't think it's predestined. And China, for all its internal repression, for all its buildup of its military, It hasn't gotten involved in a lot of wars in the
Yes,
last
actually
30
the
years.
Western countries have fought more wars. in the
Much worse,
post-Cold
yeah,
War.
exactly. The United States has fought many wars. I think China, by the technical definition of war, has not fought a war since 1987. And even that, with that that border skirmish with Vietnam was pretty small.
Yeah. But there are internal battles they're doing in Xinjiang.
Well, Tibetans and Uyghurs, yes.
So that actually brings me to the problem of liberalism. Liberalism is the core of what Enlightenment gave us to some extent. The so-called decline of liberal values, liberal internationalism, and the tendency among Western countries themselves to abandon some of these core principles that's happening in the United States today. Some argue that liberals don't have good leaders. They don't have good Enlightenment thinkers, and they are sort of leaving it to the populist. They are not learning from their mistakes. For instance, the liberals of the past, like Roosevelt, the whole idea of welfare state, they compensated for the problems of capitalism and weaknesses with these social democratic ideas, but they missed out today. They don't understand the problem of this 30% of the population that is not so well. So what is the problem with liberalism? How do we save liberalism? Because everybody knows liberalism is needed. How do we save it from these onslaughts coming from liberals themselves?
Yes.
Or liberal states themselves?
Yes. Well, the populist rise within liberal states is often driven by a large and vocal minority. Even in the United States, Hillary Clinton won a majority of or at least the plurality of the popular vote in 2016.
Yes.
And electoral systems that overweight rural areas will tend to give more power to populists than they actually possess of the population.
Yes.
There will be some, I think, significant pushback against populism from certain ongoing trends. Urbanization, since populism is very much a rural phenomenon. Education, since it's the less educated who are more supportive of populism. And generational turnover. Support for populism falls off a cliff with each generation. And so as the World War II generation and the baby boomers die off and are replaced by the Gen X's and the millennials, there'll be some natural recession of populism. But nonetheless, you are absolutely right that the open society, liberal, secular Democrats have not done a good enough job at either reforming the system or in making their case.
Defending
it. They've allowed the right-wing populists, the left-wing socialists to have passionate agendas and have not, you're right, there are very few people who are standing up and saying, well, liberal democracy for all its flaws is a pretty good system. And the rules-based international order for all its flaws is better than what we had before.
Yes. An example is the interventionary wars the liberals have fought in the past 2 decades or so. There are a lot of people who question those wars. The tendency to Iraq, Syria, Libya, whatever, Syria partly, intervene and then leave it to this mess and then try. There's no exit strategy. There's no reformation of these places. So you have all this messiness in the international regional orders. And I think the liberals have to think about the need for coordinated efforts, but not military solution to problems that are more social reconstruction. That's a bit of a problem in the United States. I mean, even Obama, complains that he was forced into Libya by the Europeans. But the Europeans are the same, and they have this human rights idea, which everybody agrees, but is force and coercion the way to go, or are other mechanisms, peaceful mechanisms?
No, I think that's exactly the right question. It's clear that the military interventions were disasters. I don't think very few people would defend them, especially now.
Right.
And whether you call them liberal or not, I mean, George W. Bush wasn't exactly a liberal.
He was using liberal ideas.
But he was using liberal ideas, the spread of democracy, the democratic peace. It was, now we especially see it was a harebrained idea.
Yes.
And Libya, again, it was too hasty. I think there was too much of people were reacting to Gaddafi's sons talking about rivers of blood. And decapitating a regime and leaving anarchy.
Yes.
I think
failed
realizing
state,
more creating an instant failed state is not a good idea.
And I would bring in something that you probably don't mention much, is called structural violence. That due to these liberal interventions, Iraq, we know that the sanctions, economic sanctions, are a form of structural violence. John Miller, our common friend, talks about this as carpet bombing by other means. If 100,000 Iraqi children die in lack of medicine, that's a carpet bombing type of activity, slow death. So these sort of structural violence, Johan Galtung talks about it, I think gives us a pause that the peaceful change that you have the data may be one type of peaceful change, but there is other forms of violence still going on. Partly due to liberal failures and, of course, failures of these other authoritarian models.
Yes, and the dilemma is that trying to apply pressure for humanitarian aims by non-military means, it is tempting to impose economic sanctions.
Right.
In some cases, that just reduces people's standards of living, but in the Iraq case, it did lead to real hardship and death. So the international community needs levers of pressure that do the minimal human damage. And in that case, sanctions were not the answer.
Right. One of the big question is, if there is no fear of war, why the extraordinary speed with new weapons are invented? Modernized nuclear weapons, for instance. Obama signed this $1 trillion modernization plan. He won a Nobel Prize for nuclear abolition. So this.
Well, he traded that, as I recall, for the military agreeing to go and Congress going with New START.
Yeah.
So it was a kind of, I think he was kicking the can down the road, figuring New START now is worth signing off on a 30-year program that perhaps in the future other presidents will.
So that's the technological momentums in the past led to the Germans adopting the Blitzkrieg with the tank and the aircraft. Technology allowing offensive doctrines, if you have an ideology to support that, to engage in certain activities. So people worry about AI as well as outer space. We don't know who the next Hitler would be or the type of aggressive figure who may use it for advancing their goal. Of course, this is a conjecture too, but isn't there a danger of this technological momentum going out of track at this point in time in the future?
Well, it's too early to say. I mean, with the advance in weaponry has come, at least since 1945, a huge reduction in deaths from war.
Yes.
And certainly old-fashioned military technology.
Yeah.
In mid-20th century, aerial bombardment and artillery and tank battles kill people by the hundreds of thousands and millions. So it's possible that precision weaponry would lead to far fewer deaths.
More deterrence.
More deterrence and less, that's a horrible euphemism, collateral damage. But best of all would be to nip arms races in the bud and not have them in the first place. And certainly the trajectory that Trump and Putin are putting the world on, a new nuclear arms race, is a terrible idea. It should be going in the opposite direction, the direction of even the Cold War hawks like Kissinger, George Shultz, and William Perry, and Sam Nunn. Or the idea of, at least as a transition, switching to a deterrence-only nuclear policy.
Limited.
No
200 weapons are enough, they say, for deterrence.
Yes, and that's, I mean, clearly that is the direction that we ought to go in. We're not going that way, but partly it's that the press, I think it's irresponsible in not making that
Very true.
focus of political debate.
Yes.
In 2016, there was endless discussion of Hillary Clinton's email server.
Yes.
There was no discussion of nuclear stability.
Right.
And likewise in the campaign coming up, we hear about health insurance and student loans and police shootings. But the biggest issue in the world, other than climate change, is nuclear stability.
And the social movements don't talk about much. Peace movements used to be stronger during the Cold War, but now everybody is backtracking.
Yes, so, I agree.
I was very intrigued by one conclusion you have in the new book about humanity's political philosophers needing to learn more about science and principles of reason, and I agree with you on that. But I have the opposite argument too, which is the technocrats and the scientists and the doctors tend to be not learning from social science, and there is a danger of, or liberal arts, Enlightenment in particular. And if you look at many countries, the biggest supporters of fundamentalism, religious fundamentalism, even terrorism, are the scientifically oriented individuals. And I think which is a big puzzle, because they say there's a binary view. They're very brilliant people, but they also are very prone to these ideas. I mean, I know in India I come from, this is happening. So nationalism in particular, they get attracted, religious nationalists. What explains that? I mean, don't you think it is necessary that we include Enlightenment ideas, liberal arts education, compulsory education, global education to the so-called technocratic class education as well?
Oh, yes. I mean, it depends on the liberal arts and humanities education, because a lot of humanities departments in Western universities have been taken over by postmodernism, which is a counter-Enlightenment philosophy and opposed to reason and science and evidence and progress. But if it is greater awareness of history of ideas and the history in general, then I think that is essential. I mean, on average, according to the World Values Survey, which is studied some 80 countries over 40 years, in general, greater education, greater openness to ideas is correlated with more liberal values.
Sure. But there is this argument that if people are not taught these values in college classes, universities, then they need not become liberal in their later life. The second thing is critical theorists. I'm not a critical theorist, but they would defend by arguing that if they didn't criticize these existing models, nobody would make any change. You know, I mean, they are the source of criticisms, whether you agree with them or not, of some of these existing practices. So even Enlightenment thinkers are critical thinkers, no? So critical thinkers.
I don't know if you mean critical theory.
Critical theorists.
Capital C,
Yeah.
capital T, that's the Frankfurt School of
Yeah, that kind of-
Adorno
yes.
and Horkheimer, or do you just mean skepticism,
Skepticism,
criticism, debate?
yes.
Certainly the latter is absolutely indispensable. It's debatable how much constructive influence the Frankfurt School of Critical Theory itself has wielded. But certainly criticism in the sense of being skeptical of ideas, debating them, not accepting anything from authority is absolutely essential.
So let me conclude by saying, what are you working on now, and any plans for advancing this into a more global, beyond the West, you know, sort of thinking at this point? Or you...
Well, you know, as I say, it's absolutely essential that it be global, just because these ideas are not, all ideas have to come from somewhere.
Sure.
Some of these ideas came from the West, but that doesn't make them Western ideas. It's
Yes.
either good ideas or bad ideas. For my own work, I've been doing research on phenomenon of common knowledge in the game theorist sense of I know something, you know something, I know that you know it, you know that I know it, I know that you know that I know that you know it ad infinitum, and how I believe this plays a huge role in human and social life, that it underlies phenomena of politeness, of hypocrisy, of civility, of genteel coexistence, of taboo, of outrage. And so there are a large number of social and political and economic phenomena that depend on the difference between knowing something and knowing that everyone else knows it. So I'm going to have a book in 3 years called Don't Go There.
We hope to see you again on that book, and with that note, thank you, Professor Pinker. It's a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you.